Right. Hang on a sec. I have some problem. Oops. Very good. Right. Well, let us start. Welcome to today's talk held by Gyeongsang University Center for Social Studies. My name is Dae-oup Chang, and I'm gonna facilitate today's talk. We are very delighted finally to have Adam Hanieh. Adam was supposed to give a talk a couple of weeks ago, but then for personal reasons, he couldn't give the talk, and he kindly allowed us to reschedule the meeting, this talk, and then finally we have him here today. I'm very glad. Adam Hanieh is a very good friend of mine, and he's a professor of political economy and global development now in University of Exeter, and he's also joint chair at the Institute of International and Area Studies at Tsinghua University in China. Before joining Exeter, actually he recently joined Exeter. He was a professor of development studies at SOAS, University of London, where he taught development studies, political economy, and also studies of Palestine and so on for more than 10 years. And he was also co-chair of the SOAS Center for Migration and Diaspora Studies. His research focus is on the political economy of the Middle East, particularly, with an emphasis on this Gulf Cooperation Council. His work basically examines the role of Gulf state within global capitalism. In other words, I think Adam's great contribution is that he brings back the Middle East into sort of wider understanding, analysis of global capitalism, as well as theoretical debates around major issues in global capitalism, such as class and state formation and race and migration, and etc. His book, he published many books. He's very hardworking person. He published many books, and amongst that, his recent book, Money Markets and Monarchies, the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Political Economy of Contemporary Middle East, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. And the book was awarded the 2019 British International Studies Association International Political Economy Group Book Prize, and the 2019 Political Economy Book Prize of Arab Studies Institute. And if you find Adam's talk today very interesting, then I highly recommend you anybody to read Adam's article published in New Left Review in 2021 called Petrochemical Empire, which is very much related to the talk that he's giving to us today. So without further ado, I think it's time to introduce Adam to all of you. Adam, please.
Thank you very much, Dae-oup, and thank you to everyone in Korea and elsewhere who are joining this talk. It's a really great pleasure to be here with you all today. I went to Korea a few years ago and really was a great meeting everyone, and hopefully at some point in the future we can do these kinds of seminars in person again. As Dae-oup mentioned, today I'm really trying to think through the relationship between the Middle East, and particularly the Gulf Cooperation Council states, and development in Asia, East Asia, through the lens of oil. So it's this part of some kind of new work that I'm looking at oil and oil's place in capitalism, and particularly the way that the Middle East and Asia development in these two regions of the world are becoming increasingly intertwined and integrated. So it's a really a great pleasure to be able to share some of this evolving work with you all today. So I'm going to begin by just looking a little bit at, if I can, Dae-oup. Yes, here we go. The relationship between oil and capitalism, as is very well known, and many people have written on this topic over the last years, that there was a very important transition in the mid-20th century towards oil as the main form of circulating constant capital within the circuit of capital. In other words, prior to this moment, coal and other kinds of energy sources had been the main kind of input, both as an energy and fuel input into the turnover of capital. In the mid-20th century, beginning earlier than that, particularly in the United States in the early 20th century, but by certainly the Second World War and shortly after the Second World War, oil had supplanted coal as the main form of circulating constant capital, i.e. as an energy source and as a raw material input into the production of commodities. This transition was crucial to the expansion of the world market throughout the 20th century. It helped fuel different kinds of transport, automobiles obviously as the main example of this, but aeroplanes, different kinds of shipping, different kinds of powering of railroads as a transport fuel. It became, very importantly, oil the basis of commodity production more generally through petrochemicals in, again, the mid-20th century onwards, when many of the kind of normal or kind of naturally occurring materials were supplanted by synthetic goods produced through and ultimately derived from petroleum, such as plastics and nylon and these kinds of fertilizers and these kinds of synthetic materials. And also oil became, very importantly, integrated into the world financial system, again, from the mid-20th century onwards, as the financial surpluses associated with the sale of oil became incorporated into both the US dollar, hegemony of the US dollar, and also financial markets in Europe and elsewhere. So these different aspects of oil, I think, are important to highlight to really point to the way that oil became woven into the nature of capitalism today. It was associated closely with the rise of US power, again, particularly following the Second World War. It was US oil companies that were dominant for much of this history. And the US itself was a major oil producer and major oil exporter. So all of these features of oil show the way that oil is integrally woven into capitalism, but also obviously connected to the ecological question and the need for an ecological transition away from fossil fuels, and in particular away from a reliance on oil. So just to give a brief history of brief history of the structure of ownership of world oil. We see through the early 20th century the emergence of what became called the Seven Sisters. These are the largest, or were at their time, 7 large oil companies. They were Western oil companies headquartered in the United States and also Western Europe. Companies such as ExxonMobil, or what became ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Shell, BP, Chevron. These companies, these 7 sisters, were highly integrated, vertically integrated firms. They controlled, in other words, the production of oil from its the production oil from its extraction through to its refining, the circulation of oil, control over pipelines, the control over tankers, and of course the retailing and marketing of oil. So each step in the transformation of the oil commodity was controlled by these just 7 firms that had an immense concentration of ownership throughout this period. Now, as these 7 sisters, which were primarily centered around the US and were closely associated, as I said, with the rise of the US through the World War II, post-World War II period, the Middle East began to emerge as the main oil producing region globally. This was particularly important for Europe and Western Europe and oil consumption in Western Europe. So as Western Europe transitioned to away from coal towards oil, it became particularly reliant upon oil supplies from the Middle East that were controlled at that point almost exclusively by these 7 sisters, by these 7 large oil companies. Overlaid, of course, on the structures of European colonialism as had evolved in the early 20th century. Now, as is well known, through the 1960s and 1970s, with the emergence of national liberation movements, anti-colonial struggles in the Middle East and Latin America, in oil-producing regions in those two areas, we see the eventual weakening of these 7 sisters and the emergence of OPEC in 1960, and the control in particular of upstream oil, in other words, the actual oil fields, the crude oil, the extraction of crude oil by the main oil producing states globally. Middle East is really central to this, Saudi Arabia in particular, but all of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Gulf Arab states. Iran is also very important. Iraq is very important. In Latin America, Venezuela, Mexico are also significant oil producers at the time. So we see the nationalization of upstream oil and the 7 sisters, the weakening of the 7 sisters' control of that moment of the crude oil extraction, and instead these large Western oil firms, the ones that we know today, ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, and so forth, they start to move more downstream into the refining, petrochemical, and retailing of oil itself. Through the 1990s and 2000s, these large Western oil companies undergo a wave of consolidation, centralization and concentration of capital, and they form through these mergers and various acquisitions what we call today the super majors, firms such as ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, Shell, Total, the French company, a handful of firms mostly descended from what were the 7 sisters. And at the same time, we get the rise of what I will refer to, and others refer to as the NOCs, or the National Oil Companies. So these are state-owned oil firms headquartered in the main oil-producing countries such as Saudi Arabia. So here, really standing out here is Saudi Aramco, which I'll have a lot more to say about later in this talk. And then later, through the 1990s and 2000s, Chinese national oil companies, in particular Sinopec and the China National Petroleum Corporation. So basically, just to recap, we have this transition through the 7 from highly concentrated Western-centered oil industry, global oil industry, through most of the 20th century, coming afterwards through the 1960s and 1970s with the formation of OPEC. National oil companies begin to emerge, particularly concentrated in the crude oil segment of the oil industry, while these Western firms, the super majors or the IOCs, the international oil companies such as Exxon and so forth, remain very strong, but concentrated more around the downstream, i.e. the refining and the retail of oil itself. Now, what we see over the last 2 decades is a very important shift in the changing geographies of oil production and consumption, which really does point to the connections that we see emerging between development of capitalism in Asia, East Asia, and China in particular, and the Middle East as a main oil producing zone globally. So with the rise of China and the broader reconfiguration of East Asian capitalism, there occurs a dramatic shift in world oil through the 2000s, basically from 2000 onwards. What we see through this period is a very significant rise in oil demand from China in particular. So on this graph, you can see on the right-hand side the oil consumption by region. It's the yellow on that graph on the right is the Asia Pacific region, in particular China, but not simply China. We see a very large increase in the consumption of oil, obviously associated with China's industrialization, and set within the wider East Asian production system that Dae-oup has written quite extensively about. So we see this rise of China and consumption of oil by East Asia. Associated with this was a significant rise also in the price of oil that occurred through this period, which meant that there was increasing financial surpluses accumulating in the main oil producing states. Again, particularly I'm interested in the Gulf states around this. Now, if we look on the other graph here, the oil production by region, we also see another very interesting and important trend that occurs through this period. Because while the Middle East, which is the orange band in this graph on the left, remains a major part of oil production globally, we also see in the green down the bottom of this graph a significant increase in North American, i.e. US and Canadian, oil production through this period. So this meant that basically the US emerges through this time as the world's largest oil producer. And the reason for this is the shift in the US and Canada towards non-conventional oil, shale and other kinds of difficult and expensive to produce oil through fracking and other kinds of means that depends upon high oil prices. In other words, for this to be profitable, it needs the price of oil to be relatively high. So with the rise in the price of oil from the early 2000s onwards, shale and these non-conventional oil supplies become profitable. The US becomes a major producer of oil through this period. So these two trends are really important to kind of set in the background of what I want to speak about today. On one hand, the emergence of China and the wider Asia region as the main oil consumer, in particular in relying upon imports of oil. And similarly, on the other side, the emergence of the United States as a key producer and Canada as a key producer of oil through this period. Now, what we can see, this basically says a similar kind of story to what I've discussed in that last slide. We can see here a very sharp increase in the consumption growth of oil between 2000 and 2019, particularly in the Asia Pacific region. This is where the demand for oil is coming from. This this slide here again gives some indication of this. We see on the left-hand graph here the top 10 oil consuming countries globally. We can see in particular, the US and China. China's growth, a share of world consumption increasing from 6% in 2000 to 14% in 2019. The US drops over this period, but still remains very important site of oil consumption. We can also see in that left-hand graph that the wider Asia region, particularly Japan and South Korea, remain very importantly important parts of world consumption. And we can also see the top 10 oil-producing countries as a share of world production. Also on that graph on the right-hand side, again, the dramatic rise in the US production. Saudi Arabia remains very key. Russia, obviously in the news today, emerges as a key producer as well, as does Canada and elsewhere. But we see the concentration of production globally in just a handful of countries, 10 or so countries, the majority of the world's oil production. So importantly, what we need to understand about these trends is that the consumption of oil in Asia, and in particular in China, depends fundamentally upon imports into the region. Although China is a significant oil producer, you can see in the graph on the right here that China is actually ranked 7th in the world in terms of oil production. It cannot meet its own domestic oil needs. It depends fundamentally upon importing oil from elsewhere around the world, in particular from the Middle East. Whereas, on the other hand, the United States, even though it is a major consumer of oil, it largely meets its consumption through its own production and also Canadian, wider North American production of oil. So United States or North America is much more self-contained in terms of its production and consumption of oil, whereas the China and the wider Asia region depends fundamentally upon these oil imports from elsewhere. So if we look at the next graph, yes, here we are. We can see basically these trade movements of oil globally. We can see that the Middle East, which is the orange area straight in the center of this map, is really where a lot of the Asian region oil imports depend upon, whereas the North American system is much more self-contained, particularly trade between Canada and the United States and internally here. So just to give you an indication of what this means, here we have in this graph the indication of a really quite extraordinary increase in oil imports by China since the early 2000s. China is the gray line on that graph. And you can see that between 2000 and 2019, China emerged as the second largest oil importer after the whole of Europe. So the orange line, Europe, so this is 26 countries or however many countries we're speaking about. China emerges as the second largest oil importer. The emergence of China is basically equivalent to a new United States entering the world market over this period. So It's quite extraordinary to see this growth in Chinese oil imports. At the same time, Japan, which was the third largest importer regionally back in the 1990s, remains quite important, but its overall imports has declined somewhat, consequent to China's rise. Nonetheless, it's still, and Japan and other Asian importers remain important to the world oil trade. So the key takeaway from this graph is the rise in Chinese oil imports, and associated with that, we see that these oil imports depend fundamentally upon oil from the Middle East. So in this table here, you can see that just under 50% of Chinese oil imports in 2019 came from the Middle East region. In particular, Saudi Arabia, followed by Iraq, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates. These countries are crucial to meeting China's energy demands. Russia also is very important here. 15% of Chinese oil imports coming from Russia. And elsewhere around the world, we see an increase in demand for oil going to China, but nowhere near the consumption that is dependent upon the Middle East region. So the basic point, and I want to kind of explore this point as I move forward for the rest of this presentation, is that there is an increasing interdependency between capitalist development in the Middle East and capitalist development in the Asia region, in particular connected to China's emergence within the world system. Now, as I really want to emphasize moving forward, this is not simply about oil as a raw material. It is also about other kinds of interdependencies that emerge across the oil circuit. Oil needs to be transformed into other kinds of materials. It is not much use simply as a crude substance. It has to be refined, it has to be transformed into fuels, into chemicals, into plastics, and other kinds of commodities that are so crucial to the way that East Asian capitalism is developing today. So these interdependencies across the oil circuit are not simply about the export of crude oil itself, as we'll see as we move forward. So just to further reiterate this point, the share of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and United Arab Emirates oil exports that are going to Asia, you can see here in this pie graph, 69% of the oil exports from these countries are actually coming from these, are going to Asia. So you can see how important. Now, this is really a historic shift. Prior to this moment, most of the, prior to the 2000s, most of the Gulf's oil exports actually went west, either to Europe or to the United States. So there has been an eastward shift concomitant with the rise of China in the Gulf's oil exports eastward towards Asia and China in particular. Okay, so let's have a look at what this might mean if we look more at this kind of interconnection of capitalism in both Middle East and East Asia, and what it might mean for a whole range of questions. Firstly, the centrality of this China Gulf access to world oil, whether it be through consumption, whether it be through production, and of course export and trade of oil, means that Chinese and Gulf oil firms increasingly shape the dynamics of the world oil industry. Now, These firms, as I will come to in a second, are fall into those NOx category, the national oil companies. They are large state-owned or mostly state-owned companies, controlled or headquartered in China and the Middle East region. There's very close interdependencies between these firms, as we'll see, and they increasingly shape the dynamics of world oil, including pricing dynamics of oil. The other thing that we see, and I'll show you some trends around this in a second, is the internationalization of capital within the oil commodity circuit. In other words, the flow of capital, cross-border flow of capital, not simply into oil fields and the production of oil, but all moments of the oil circuit: refining, pipelines, the storage of oil, petrochemicals, plastics. We see this internationalization of capital, which is again reinforcing these interdependencies between the Gulf and China and East Asia. And what this means is that the processes of capital accumulation and class formation in the Gulf are increasingly linked to East Asian capitalism itself. Now, this, as I've said, is not just a question of oil as an energy source or fuel. It's also connected to other kinds of interdependencies around financial markets, banks, and other kinds of finance, other kinds of manufacturing, as well as questions of currency, in particular the US dollar's role as world money, which is very closely associated with oil as a commodity. And I'll come to that towards the end of this presentation. So just to move along. So as I said, we see the rise of these NOx, which in a sense embody this emergence of the China Gulf axis in world oil. And outside of North America and Europe, these national oil companies are huge. They dominate the production. You can see in this graph the share of oil production that's controlled by national oil companies. So the big one here is Saudi Aramco, which was listed on the Saudi stock market a few years ago, valued at $2 trillion. I think certainly at one point it was the largest company by market capitalization in the world. I think it might have been pipped at that by Apple at one point, but perhaps with the recent rise in the price of oil, it still remains at that level. So these national oil companies, Saudi Aramco in Saudi Arabia, but also PetroChina and Sinopec in China are very important examples of this. They control, outside of North America, most of the oil production. Okay, you can see in the Middle East around 89% of oil production in 2019 was controlled by national oil companies, whereas in North America and Europe, national oil companies are not really present to any great degree. The industry remains largely driven by those Western private firms that were the descendants of the Seven Sisters that I spoke about earlier. Now, importantly, as I keep stressing, we can't think oil simply as a crude material. We need to think about how is oil refined and turned into a useful product, a fuel or further refining into chemicals and elsewhere. So the refining industry is really important to understand what's going on globally. And we can see, again, these graphs I think are really interesting because we look at the left side. This is the share of world refining capacity by region. So this is where most of the world's refining, or where the world refining is spatially distributed. We can see that there has been an enormous rise between the early 1990s and today in refining capacity held in the Asia Pacific, from 18% to around 37% of world refining capacity in the Asian region. And as Asia has overtaken the world in this respect, North America, which previously stood out as the center of refining, has fallen. And every other region of the world has fallen in terms of refining capacity, except for the Middle East. Okay, so basically we see Asia and the Middle East as the two areas of the world where refining capacity is growing. And it is likely the Middle East will overtake Europe quite soon in terms of refining capacity. And again, what this means is that the national oil companies, the firms that I've mentioned, and I'll come to again in a next slide, are taking a greater share of world refining. So again, this is what's really important in the oil circuit, is turning oil from a crude substance into something that can be used. So we can see very high share of refining capacity controlled by these national oil companies. Now, the thing about this, it is crucial to recognize, is that globally, refining is immensely concentrated. 15 companies control about half of all refining capacity in the world. So we're talking about a handful of large companies that control the refining of oil. Now, in 1999, the largest three refiners were these Western oil companies, the descendants of the Seven Sisters that I mentioned earlier: Royal Dutch Shell, or Shell, Exxon, which later became ExxonMobil, and BP Amoco, which today is we know as BP. So these were the top three refiners globally in 1999. Today, only ExxonMobil is ranked within the top four. And the other, the first, second, and fourth spots in refining are taken by Chinese and Gulf Saudi national oil companies: Sinopec, CNPC, the China National Petroleum Corporation, and Aramco. So what we see is increasingly these large NOCs are themselves becoming vertically integrated. They're following the same trajectory that Western oil companies followed in the mid-20th century, moving down the value chain of oil itself. So not just the crude extraction, but it's refining and it's processing into chemicals and plastics and other forms, controlling each of those stages. Also associated with this, controlling the circulation of the oil commodity. So pipelines, tankers, and the transport and the retailing of oil, service stations and those kinds of things. So this vertical integration within the oil industry is becoming a feature of these national oil companies. So just to again show you what these are, the top 15 companies between 1999, 2011, and 2019, and you can see the trends that I've mentioned earlier. In 1999, we really see these large Western companies as the main refiners. Remember, these companies, these 15 companies, control half of the world's oil refining. They are enormously important to capitalist production. Now, in 2019, we can see the predominance of national oil companies: Sinopec, CNPC in China, Aramco in Saudi Arabia, Rosneft in Russia, which BP had a share of and is trying to, at the moment, separate itself from. The Venezuelan national oil company here is important. Brazilian national oil company is important. Iran, alongside these continued ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, and so forth. Now, So this refining capacity is really important to consider. And as we can see here, increasing share of global refining capacity held by national oil companies. Now, if we move beyond refining to think about some of the ways that this internationalization of capital that I spoke about earlier is emerging within the world oil industry. We here in this table, this is looking at mergers and acquisitions in world oil. So I've defined here world oil broadly. Again, I'm not speaking only about crude oil, upstream oil. I'm also talking here about refining, about pipelines, about oil service companies, about petrochemical companies. So all stages of the oil circuit of capital. We can see that most of this is in number of deals. Most of the deals were focused on North America and Western Europe over this period predominantly. Deals that were worth more than 1.5 billion. So these are kind of mega deals. We can again see the predominance of North America and then Western Europe within this. Although China, other Asian countries, Russia, the Middle East also figure predominantly or figure importantly within these large mega deals. So this is these are mergers and acquisitions. Now, the thing about this graph, which is I think really quite interesting, is that if we look a bit more at these large mergers and acquisitions in the world oil circuit, we can see that, again, in the second to last column here, that the North America, which is the predominant focus of where these mergers and acquisitions have taken place, is largely self-contained within the North American region. Instead, it's capital that's coming from Western Europe, China, Russia, and the Gulf that are involved in cross-regional mergers and acquisitions. So when we're speaking about internationalization of capital in world oil, i.e. cross-border flows into all these moments of the oil circuit, it is not North American. Even though North America has the predominant form of is the center of where mergers and acquisitions have happened, the cross-border flows or the interregional flows tend to be outside of North America. North America has a much smaller share within these cross-border flows in the oil circuit. Now, in particular, as I'm going to look at a bit more closely, China and the Middle East and the Gulf region are very important to these cross-border flows. So, yep. Between 2012 and 2021, China has made more than $76 billion in outward investments in oil-related activities. So again, all sections of the oil circuit. Now, these investments have really followed two phases. The first phase, which was associated with China's Belt and Road Initiative, was investment in North America, Western Europe, and Russia, Central Asia oil industries. In North America, particularly the shale industry, and in elsewhere, looking at the route of the BRI route, where China took important stakes in shale producing companies in North America, took over the assets of Western oil companies in places like Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Egypt, Mozambique, and elsewhere, and also took stakes in pipelines and refineries in these areas. So this first phase, 2012 to 2016, was primarily focused on those regions. After 2016, there has been a major shift towards the Middle East in terms of China's outward investments in the oil sector. More than 30% of Chinese investments went to the Middle East and North Africa region between 2017 and 2021, more than any other part of the world in terms of where China invested in the oil circuit. So it became, the Middle East region has become really quite a center, if you like, of Chinese outward investment in the oil circuit. So here you can see what I've just said in a tabular form. You can see around 32% Middle East and North Africa in the 2017 to 21 period. Remember, this is 2 years of global pandemic as well in these figures, but it remains really quite key to how China has internationalized into these sectors, into this sector. I won't spend too much time on this. This is just a table looking at some of these examples of where they've invested over the last 20 or so years. China, or sorry, 10 or so years into shale, as I mentioned, in North America, assets in other countries. Okay, but I want to look from, so this tells us China has become has turned towards the Middle East in terms of its investments. Simultaneously, however, the Gulf region has also turned towards China and the wider East Asia region as part of its internationalization through the oil circuit. So here, this is external investment in the Asian Petroleum Circuit between 2012 and 2021. Now, what I mean by this is I've looked at a handful of countries. You can see them at the bottom there. China, including Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, Thailand, Singapore, and the Philippines. So these are the main destinations, if you like, of investment into petroleum assets. So again, this is not simply crude oil. It's about particularly refining. It's about service stations. It's about petrochemical plants. It's about storage tanks. All of these aspects that fit together and are so important to East Asian capitalism as a kind of a regional system. And you can see, so in this table, I'm looking at external investment. So this is investment coming outside of the region itself. Okay, not internal to the region, from outside of the region. And we can see, quite fascinating, I think, the Gulf really far in excess of any other major investing region, including North America and Western Europe. 45% over that 2012 to 2021, or in the more recent period, 49% of total investment deals coming from the Gulf into the Asian Petroleum Circuit. So we have this kind of twin phenomena. On one hand, China increasingly turning towards investing in the Gulf region throughout the oil circuit of capital, and at the same time, the Gulf increasingly integrating into the petroleum circuit in the wider Asian region. Okay, so this is this kind of twin phenomena that we're seeing. So just to give you some examples of this, which I think are really quite interesting, and also to my comrades in South Korea. I'm sure you know a lot more about this than me, so I'm actually really interested to hear your comments about the role of these kinds of institutions in Korea and elsewhere in Asia. So, for example, S-Oil, which is a very large South Korean refinery. It's actually the 6th largest. This company owns the 6th largest refinery in the world, in Ulsan, is majority owned now by Saudi Aramco. It has taken over and controls that large refining company in Korea. Also in Korea, the Hyundai Oil Bank, which I think is, I think it's the 4th largest refiner, if I'm not mistaken, is after Hyundai, the Hyundai Group, it is the second. Saudi Aramco is the 2nd largest investor, shareholder in the Hyundai Oil Bank. So it's, I think, about 17%. It owns the share of that Hyundai Oil Bank. In Malaysia, there is a joint venture between the Malaysian national oil company Petronas and Saudi Aramco, which for a petrochemical plant, a refining and petrochemical plant, which is under construction as we speak. It will be the largest downstream petrochemical project in Asia, following its completion, which I think is estimated in a couple of years' time. Again, so this is Saudi Aramco. It's a 50-50 joint venture with Petronas. Now, this is interesting to see how the structure of this is unfolding, because what we see is Saudi Aramco provides the crude oil to this refining complex, which then gets processed into petrochemicals and other kinds of fuels and commodities. And then both Petronas and Saudi Aramco manage the distribution and the sale and the circulation into the wider Asian region of these products. So again, as Dae-oup has emphasized in his work, we need to kind of see the circulation, I think, of these oil commodities within a regional perspective. They may be produced in Malaysia, but they're not necessarily consumed in Malaysia. They end up elsewhere in Asia, and part of the kind of circulation of commodities more generally regionally. Another example, refiner is the major shareholder alongside the Idemitsu family, a large Japanese conglomerate, is Saudi Aramco. Again, this is a very recent acquisition that took place by Aramco. In China, there's a whole range of refining and petrochemical joint ventures between the Gulf and China that are underway or have been announced again. So I think it's quite, I find it really interesting that we see this kind of connections emerging very concretely in these areas. I've mentioned petrochemicals quite a lot because they are so important. And basically, the future of oil is many industry spokespeople talk about oil's future as being basically coming from petrochemicals, because the use of petroleum to process in plastics and other kinds of synthetic materials is very difficult to substitute. You can substitute oil in transport fuels, electric cars, or solar energy and other kinds of things, but to use its basis as the basis of commodity production is much more difficult to substitute. So again, if we look at the petrochemical industry globally, even though the United States remains very important and those kind of Western petrochemical, Western firms that I've spoken about throughout this presentation remain very key. There has been a real shift towards petrochemical production in China and the wider Asia region. Indeed, in 2017, nearly 40% of chemical industry revenues came from China. Okay, the rate of growth of the Chinese chemical industry is much faster than anywhere else in the world. Similarly, the Gulf is also one of the major emerging regions for chemical production, petrochemical production. And this is particularly true in a substance called ethylene, which is often described as the basic building block of petrochemicals. The Gulf is now the second largest producer of ethylene, just behind North America. It has about 19% of world capacity of ethylene. So again, all of the kind of manufacturing that we see taking place in China and elsewhere depends to a significant degree upon these inputs, these raw material inputs that are ultimately derived from ethylene. So two very large chemical firms, Sinopec, Chinese firm, and Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia's SABIC. SABIC, by the way, has just been taken over by Saudi Aramco. So we see again this integration of a oil firm, national oil firm, down the value stream towards petrochemicals. So SABIC is now part of Saudi Aramco. So Sinopec and SABIC rank as the second and fourth largest petrol companies in the world. Back in 2000, Sinopec didn't even make the top 50, and SABIC was 29th largest. So again, we see the significance of these firms. Sinopec is not simply chemical producer; it's also involved in the retailing and distributing of oil, as we see in this picture here as well. So I'll start to wrap up now in these last couple of slides. I mentioned that we are seeing these kinds of interdependencies between East Asian capitalism and the Gulf and the Middle East more generally, which is beyond simply the oil circuit, although the oil circuit is obviously really key to this. But we also can see it in other kinds of circulation of financial surpluses between the Gulf, China, and East Asia, in banking in particular. We also see, related to the trends that I discussed earlier with the emergence of the China-Gulf axis as being really central to world oil, the attempt by China to set up its own benchmark, pricing benchmark for oil itself. So currently, oil is priced in US dollars, and there are two main pricing benchmarks: the WTI in the United States, based in the US markets, and Brent, the Brent benchmark, which is based in Europe. China has set up, as part of the Shanghai Futures Exchange, an oil benchmark for use of trading of oil in Asia, denominated in RMB. So again, given that the majority of China's oil imports are coming from the Gulf region, also from the wider Middle East, but particularly Saudi Arabia, this will be it'll be really important to see how this denomination in RMB evolves, because the supremacy of the US dollar as world money depends to a significant extent on the denomination of oil in US dollars. So any discussion about whether the RMB will supplant the US dollar will partly depend upon whether these kind of alternative benchmarks denominated in non-US dollar currencies are eventually successful. There are other aspects to this, obviously connected, the Gulf and Chinese connections connected to the BRI. For example, China's, the 4 banks involved in China's BRI are all regionally, their activities in the Middle East, Central Asia, and Africa. They are headquartered in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. So the Gulf financial markets are emerging as quite a key center for China's, the financial dimensions to China's BRI project through the headquartering of these banks. I mentioned Islamic finance, and please don't misunderstand me here. I'm not trying to say by any stretch that Islamic finance is the dominant form of finance in the Gulf. However, the Gulf does possess if you like, a comparative advantage in Islamic finance, being the center of Islam. And some very large Islamic financial institutions are headquartered in the Gulf banks in the Gulf region. And I think it's important to see that one dimension to the internationalization of Gulf capital into Asia is actually through Islamic finance, particularly in places like Malaysia and Indonesia, where there are significant Islamic financial markets. So again, it's another aspect to thinking through these interdependencies that we see. Finally, I want to end with perhaps the most important question, which is, what does all this mean in terms of ecological futures? This axis between the Gulf and Asia. We can see that there has been, as I said earlier, a shift in terms of both the production and export and consumption of fossil fuels towards the Middle East and Asia. Even though the goods that are produced in places such as China may get exported out of the region to elsewhere in the world, but this means that any debates around how do we move away from oil, how do we pursue an ecological transition, are intimately bound up with this connection between the Middle East and Asia itself. This is true, again, not simply in terms of crude oil, but also plastics and petrochemicals productions, as I spoke about a few slides ago. And it's also true in terms of plastic waste. Indeed, quite remarkable, some of these figures that I have here on the slide. Since 1992, just under half of all global plastics waste has been exported to China. So Asia was not simply the producer of these petrochemicals, it was also the repository of the waste coming from Western consumption of plastics and other kinds of petrochemicals. China banned the import of plastic waste in 2018, but this has been diverted mostly to other Asian countries, and I believe Malaysia is now the top destination globally for this kind of plastic waste, which, remember, is ultimately derived from petroleum. So again, issues around recycling waste and the entire kind of turnover of petroleum, where this stuff ends up, is closely connected to what I've discussed. The final point I'll make is that, you know, I've spoken quite a lot about these national oil companies, such as Aramco, Sinopec, and others. It's also important to understand that these companies are, as part of the climate change discussions, are also diversifying outside of fossil fuels. This is true not just for the NOx, it's also true for ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and the others, where they are re-envisaging themselves as renewable energy companies as well. This is not to say that fossil fuels doesn't remain the core and the vast majority of the profits made by these companies, but the issue of renewable energy is also being driven by these Western and NOC state-owned oil firms as well. So again, debates around the transition to other kinds of energy forms will would be very much bound up with these dynamics that I've spoken about. Okay, I'll leave it there. And thank you again for the opportunity to speak. I'll stop my control of your screen, Dae-oup.
Thank you very much, Adam. Right. Wow. Thank you, Adam. For this very extensive and quite interesting talk. I think, Adam's talk, I learned a lot by reading Adam's presentation and previous articles, but I think listening from his talk, listening to his talk today, I think it's more even better, even more enlightening. I think Adam's approach shows a good example of sort of Marxist or Marxian commodity studies, because he's dealing with a particular commodity that is oil, but Adam is not really talking about oil per se. He's basically going through multiple layers of social relations of oil. And in doing so, Adam just told us that oil is not just an energy source or commodity that produce energy, but it has a greater implication on global capitalism by talking about this petroleum circuit. But not only just the petroleum circuit, but also he talks about the oil industry's relation to finance and the recomposition of global capitalism and the rising power from East Asia, etc. I think it was a super interesting talk in that sense. Well, I think in Korean context, we don't here in Korea, we don't for oil for a long time to South Korean is just a precious source of energy. And we have this saying in South Korea, a country that cannot produce a single drop of oil. That's 기름 한 방울 안 나는 나라. That's a South Korean saying, which means we have to save the energy, and that's pretty much it. And oil came from, for South Korean, oil just coming from Arab countries. That's it. From desert, that's it. That's pretty much it. And we don't even think about all other products or finance or related dimensions. In Korea, oil is just an energy source. Probably a lot of people do not even know plastics and textiles and all chemical textiles actually came from oil. We don't really think about that. So very, very educational, I think, and I appreciate that. So if you turned off your cameras, it's a time to turn it on, I think, and for interaction. So let us ask questions. I'm pretty sure a lot of people have many questions, and I do have like 10 questions by myself. So if you have any questions to Adam's regarding Adam's talk, or if you have any comments to make, or some raise a discussion point, this is time to do so. Please come forward. Yeah, Minji raised her hand. Please go ahead.
Thank you for your great talk. It was interesting perspective trace the oil circuit and global capital competition. I have a question regarding your last mention. What do you think about the Green New Deal? In your talk, China is gonna be the most powerful consumer of oil market and equivalent with US, and the old order of Western is struggling to lead the global value chain of oil industry. Do you think the Green New Deal project can be reorganized the world market of oil? Can the alternative energy source make the regime transition? Based on your talk, it seems the oil market is not done for. Rather, it seems the oil market is growing because of the new big consumer whose name is China. By the way, if the Green New Deal can make oil market and hegemony organized, is there anything that you find about the counter strategy of rising agencies, representative East Asia and Middle East? This is my question.
Do you want me to respond, Dae-oup?
It was a huge question, wasn't it? It was a huge and complicated question. If there is any more question, I think I can give you a couple of few seconds to think about Minji's question, I think. Is there any more question from the floor? Yeah, Professor Chang, please.
Adam, thank you very much. Yes, great talk. It's really very informative. I learned it very much. Yes, my question yeah, I have 3 questions. First, you described the relation between the Arab and the East Asia, so Middle East and the East Asia capitalism as interdependence, not dependence. So, do you really think, for example, the relation between Chinese state capitalism and the Middle East as national oil companies as not as just interdependent, or maybe we all know that recently the relation between Chinese state capitalism and the Latin American countries now is a kind of imperialist or extremist, extremist relations. But today's talk, you very much emphasized the interdependent relations, not the hierarchical, imperial. So don't you think that the relation between the Middle East and the East Asia, especially China, not the imperialist, or and you also emphasized that it's a capital export from Middle East towards the other countries like including East Asia. So I'm not sure. So because you do not mention about that, so I will appreciate if you could talk more about that. And my second question is also related with that. What do you think about this? In your today's talk, you emphasize the role of the NOCs, national oil companies or state-owned companies, not just in East Asia, in China, but in Middle East. So, do you think nowadays we usually describe the NOCs in China as a state capitalist? What do you think about the NOCs in Middle East? Is also state capitalist, or we know that although it's a state-owned, but mostly it's owned emir or sheikh, it's a monarch. So it could be so it's maybe the state federalism. I don't know. So it will be great if you could talk more about that. And my last question is that, so we all know that the oil is anyway, it's depleting in the near future. So nowadays, it's a petrochemical, industries is based on the oil. Is kind of sunset industries. Although, yeah, but you in today's talk, you very much emphasized the role of the petrochemicals. But still, I heard that the South Korean is a companies or the government is recently even is exported is a nuclear plant to the UAE, is the United Arab Emirates. So, and also in your today's talk, so according to your today's talk, it looks somewhat that the Middle East capitalist has a future, has a future. So you do not very much emphasize the weakness or maybe the contradictions of the capital accumulation in the Middle East capitalism. So I will appreciate if you could talk more about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Song Jin-jung. Wow. Okay, we have 4 very interesting questions. If we count first question as one question, so you can go for the easiest question to answer, Adam, the questions that you're ready to answer, and take as much time as you need. Please.
Okay. Thanks to both Mindy and Professor Zhang for these questions. Very, very good questions, and as they pointed out, quite expansive. Firstly, let me address Mindy's question about the Green New Deal and the possibilities of some kind of recomposition of the world's energy regime outside of oil or in a more ecologically sustainable manner, and how this might connect to what I was saying. I think it's really important when we think about oil and oil's place in capitalism, not to think about it as simply a commodity or as I was saying through the talk, not simply as an energy source. We need to think about the way that capitalism was really bound up with oil as the primary form taken by circulating constant capital within the circuit of capital. Now, as I pointed out, this was in the early history of capitalism, was based around coal and other kinds of energy sources. But from the mid-20th century onwards, oil really supplanted those alternatives or those other kinds of energy, and was really central to how capitalism emerged from the post-World War II era onwards. Now, this was connected to energy. It was connected to commodity production itself, the replacement of naturally occurring materials like wood, natural rubber, natural fertilizers by synthetic materials that were ultimately derived from petroleum. And it was also connected to financial markets and the way that global financial markets developed. And very, very importantly, the rise of the US as the dominant global power was, I think, inseparable from this transition from coal to oil. Now, so in other words, it's not just about oil as an energy source or as a transport fuel. It's about the way that oil is bound up with the form that capitalism took. Now, what this relates to your question is that I don't think that there is any way to talk about any kind of energy alternative that is not post-capitalist, that isn't beyond, that isn't about overthrowing capitalism as well. It's not a technical question of different kinds of automobiles or that kind of thing. So yeah, I really do think that when we're talking about that transition, and I think because oil has been so connected to the United States and the emergence of US power, I also think that China's rise is also very much connected to oil as well. I don't think that China will be able to, supplant the United States or this kind of transition, I think this will also be bound up with how China uses oil as well. And as I've said throughout the presentation, China is really dependent upon fossil fuels, oil, other fossil fuels. Coal is unfortunately another aspect to this. So I do think that I don't see this changing or that there being the emergence of a green alternative coming from China's current industrialization strategy or form of capitalism. So moving on to Professor Zhong's three questions. Yes, I did speak about interdependence and the interdependencies between the regions. That's because I chose that word deliberately, because I think what we see here is that we need to look at how does capitalism in East Asia, how is it kind of internally related to forms of capitalism in the Middle East and in the Gulf in particular. I don't think it's accurate to describe, certainly in somewhere like the Gulf, that China's relationship is an imperialist relationship, because the Gulf's oil resources are owned, controlled by the Gulf itself, as I've said. China has got involvement and has a presence in certain aspects of this, but by and large, it's still fully almost 100% dominated by these state-owned companies in the Gulf itself. Now, perhaps in the wider Middle East region, we can talk more about forms of exploitation, extractivism in countries like Egypt or in North Africa. But I don't think that would be a correct way of speaking about it in relation to the Gulf region. So in other words, we need, I think, to differentiate these relationships across the Middle East region, because to a large degree, the Gulf itself, again, I wouldn't use the word imperialist in the sense of the Gulf's relation with the rest of the Middle East, but there is an exploitative, certainly, connection between how the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and stuff relate to other Arab countries in the Middle East, for sure. So how do we think about the role of NOCs as capitalist? Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a very important one. And I think you're right. We shouldn't, in a lot of the literature around this, they talk about they kind of counterpose international oil companies, the large Western firms, to these national oil companies, as if they're kind of counterposed or in some way fundamentally different. I do think, however, that these NOCs really need to be seen as part of the way that capitalism and capitalist classes are forming and continue to form in places like the Gulf and also in places like China as well. So, for example, in Saudi Arabia, I mentioned Saudi Aramco. Yes, it's a primarily state-owned institution, but it's also listed on the stock market. It's an extremely valuable company that private individuals, capitalists in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the world own a chunk of this company through the stock market. So it's an important source of accumulation for private capitalists. Also, Saudi Aramco is involved in a whole range of joint projects with private oil-related firms, Gulf-owned and non-Gulf owned, in Saudi Arabia. So private petrochemical projects and other kinds of things. So, it's the classic story of how the state acts to support the emergence of and strengthen private capital. So the whole kind of orientation of these national oil companies it's a commercial orientation around profit and securing markets and securing resources. So I agree with you. How we need to think about these things as not counterposed or antithetic to the emergence of private capitalist classes. Around oil depletion, I mean, I think if you look closely at the history of world oil, there's never been a shortage of oil, and oil is not, unfortunately, going to run out. There's plenty of oil in the world today, and that's the story of the last 10 years with the rise of the United States and the shale oil revolution. There's plenty of oil there at the right price, because it's not a technical question. It's a question of, again, the social relations of capitalism, the kind of investment that goes into the sector, and the price at which oil sells. So when oil is at $100 or more, as it is today, these unconventional oil sources become profitable, and they come online. So it's actually, the history of oil is actually, the oil industry is one of overproduction of oil and the fear of oil gluts rather than shortages. Now, what is in shortage is, of course, the environment. So when we talk about it's not so much peak oil that we need to worry about, it's the peak atmosphere, that, you know, the planet will become completely uninhabitable way before oil runs out. So that I think is the problem that we face, and why this transition is so imperative. Contradictions in kind of capital, yeah, absolutely. I do think there's you know, a huge range of contradictions that exists within Gulf capitalism. One of the things that I couldn't really speak to, but I think is quite important to foreground in all of this, is the way that the Gulf's working classes are primarily based upon migrant labor. And Korea has a very important story obviously in all of this. It was Korean chaebol who pioneered the you know, a lot of the kind of labor patterns in the Gulf through the 1970s under the dictatorship in Korea. It was Korea who kind of pioneered the way that labor was spatially isolated from the rest of the citizen population in the Gulf, bringing over, you know, actual military workers and so forth in large construction projects that were run by Korean conglomerates. And today, more than half of the labor force in the Gulf states are made up of temporary migrant workers who have no possibility of becoming any kind of citizens or permanent residents in the country. So this extreme, this kind of structure of the working class is quite unique in the Gulf compared to other oil producing regions that tend to have, you know, if we look at Iraq or Iran, where the majority of the population are citizens, whereas in the Gulf, many Gulf states, that's not the case. So I think this is one reason why the Gulf, you know, again, to speak about oil and the social relations in which oil is embedded, why the Gulf and Saudi Arabia in particular was to play such an important role within the world oil industry. So the contradictions are there because you do have, in places like Saudi Arabia and Oman, another Gulf GCC state, significant citizen population, however, also significant levels of poverty among those citizens. We see in places like Bahrain political movements emerging in there as well. So, you know, I don't think we've seen political struggles in the Gulf since 2011 that have met with repression. So yeah, there are struggles, there are labor struggles, there are struggles around democracy or democratic greater democratic voice, and those kinds of things. And then, of course, we need to situate the Gulf within the wider Middle East, where a lot of the kind of struggles within the Middle East are connected to the Gulf's position in the region itself. So, that I think is a major contradiction in terms of how these regimes might survive moving forward.
Thank you very much. Right, yeah, great.
Yeah. Thank you, Adam, for very thorough answer. You need more water?
I've got some here. Yes.
Well, you've been talking a lot. You have, I think, a dry throat. Have some more water. I think we are finishing. From my experience, we are finishing around quarter to 9. Is that? I think that's the norm here, right? 8:45. All right. So we still have around 10 minutes up to go. Do we have any more questions? Otherwise, I will.
Owen has a question.
Oh, Owen, do you have any questions? Yes, go ahead. Please.
Yeah, hi, Adam. Nice
Hi.
to see you again after a while.
Mm.
Yeah, really interesting. And my question is out of my own interest. So I apologize if it's sort of tangential to what you're talking about. Although I think it's relevant. I think it's relevant. Yeah, it's about the relationship between oil and agricultural systems in East Asia. Although it could be applied probably most places, but I'm just curious the extent to which the agricultural system of East Asia is reliant or dependent on oil. And I have a hunch that it is very dependent. I don't have the kind of figures to hand or the understanding empirically. But I'm always aware of the fact, if we take the example of what happened to North Korea in the 1990s when they stopped receiving subsidized oil from the USSR, and basically the food system of North Korea collapsed. Obviously, there were other complex reasons behind that, but oil was a very key factor, and many people starved as a result. So I just kind of wonder, how much can we apply that to East Asia in general? How much is oil, dependency on oil part of the food system, not just in terms of fertilizer, but also mechanization. Irrigation is incredibly important in East Asia, and irrigation, as I understand it, relies on electricity and therefore quite often oil, I imagine. But so I also note you're quite pessimistic about the possibility of a transition under capitalism. So I guess that also applies to transitions in food systems away from oil. Maybe are you pessimistic about that as well? I mean, how do you feed 1.4 billion people without oil? I suppose is what I'm asking.
Shall I respond, Dae-oup? Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
So yeah, thanks for that question, Owen. I don't know the details in the East Asian context. However, more broadly, there is like quite an extensive literature talking about how this move towards oil in the post-World War II era and the kind of rise of oil as the dominant kind of form of raw material and energy source was connected to changes in the world agricultural system. So, people like Jason Moore and others have talked about this shift to the Green Revolution, the shift towards a petroleum-centered agriculture. So it meant, on one hand, the mechanization, which becomes so key, tractors and other kinds of things. It also is connected to the transport and internationalization of agriculture. The shipping of wheat and other kind of surpluses globally that began in that post-60s onwards, basically. But also very, very importantly, it's connected to petrochemicals and fertilizers and other kinds of inputs that are required for agricultural production. So, you know, people talk about this in terms of we actually eat oil these days. You know, that it's become petroleum is the basis of our agricultural system. So I imagine, I mean, this has been very, I think, well documented in places like India, Latin America, and elsewhere. I imagine from my own ignorance, but I imagine that in the East Asian food systems are quite similar in this respect. Now, again, I'm not an expert on this topic, but I do think there are ways of thinking about agriculture in less oil-intensive forms of production, whether that be through sustainable kinds of agriculture that is more that is less dependent upon international trade of surpluses, in particular wheat. You know, other kinds of livestock management, I think, become possible here. But yeah, so I do think that there's a regardless of whether it's technically possible or not, the barrier to that are these, in agriculture, the large agribusiness firms that are kind of blocking any kind of move away from that corporate type of agriculture that is based around oil and so closely connected to oil. So again, capitalism is the barrier. It's not simply a technical question.
Thank you, Adam. So just I will take advantage of my role as a facilitator to ask my questions. Very short. I mean, probably this is not even a question, but some point I want to raise. I mean, Adam, you talked about oil, but you didn't talk about oil, right? So in widening, you know, the sort of the scope of your research on oil, I think there are few areas or dimensions you can also touch upon, or probably you have, but not today much. There's one thing is production. Not production of oil-related products or anything, but general, like industrial production. Like when you show, you know, the graphs and then show how much China's oil imports is increasing dramatically, but that doesn't mean it's China who consume that oil, right? Because oil goes with foreign direct investments. Oil goes with money. So it's a Korean companies, Taiwanese companies, or other, you know, manufacturing firms invested in China, consuming that energy, and consuming oil as an energy source as well as raw material, right? So that production dimension, how that can fit into your analysis of oil. That's first thing that I want to know or talk about, if not today, later. And also second dimension is this kind of a spatial dimension, because I think you briefly mentioned that oil is not just an energy source, but it's closely bound to you know, modern contemporary global capitalism. And I think one of the most important dimension of it is the infrastructure and landscape. In other words, space, how space of capitalism is organized on the basis of fossil fuel, particularly oil. That is also quite interesting dimension, I think, and I don't know whether you somewhere else wrote about it. And finally, I mean, you talked about interdependence, and I think, I mean, East Asian capitalism on the one hand and Middle Eastern capitalism on the other hand, yeah, they are interdependent, and well, they not only exploit labor in East Asia and the Middle East, migrant workers, but also, you know, they really sort of destroy, capable of destroying the planet, as you mentioned in the end. You know, by exacerbating what they call this global metabolic rift, you know. But when usually we have this kind of problem, we talk about, you know, solidarity from both sides, but the problem with this interdependency, I don't really see any sort of linkage between Middle Eastern social movement or transformative social movement and East Asian social movement. And if you can talk about any sort of basis on which we can develop some sort of links, or if you witnessed any or experienced any kind of links, and it would be wonderful to hear from you.
Mm. Great. Yeah, thanks, Dae-oup. That's like a good set of questions to end, I think, on all of these issues. Yeah, I mean, I think on your first question about production, I think that's why your own work, for example, I think is really important to this, looking at kind of the East Asian regional system, the cross-border flows of capital, the cross-border flows of labor, the ways that different parts of capitalist classes in East Asia exploit workers, and the goods that are produced in one part or in one country feed into wider production chains in other parts of East Asia, and then from there often get exported outside to Europe or North America. Mapping these kinds of flows of labor and capital, I think, is really key. And that's why I think seeing how the Middle East and oil fits into these wider system is to me a very important task, because, you know, those patterns that I spoke about in terms of South Korea, Malaysia, Japan, these and China, the Gulf connections in those countries, these are connections that feed into this wider regional system. So, you know, Malaysian petrochemical production isn't for Malaysia, it's for elsewhere in the region, which I'm sure you know much more about than myself. So I think kind of mapping these connections is really important. And then, as you say, when we're thinking about it in terms of ecological questions, it also looking at where these goods end up, like where, you know, where the plastics or where the actual final commodities end up, and the carbon content of those commodities, not simply in terms of where they're produced, but also where they're consumed as well. If they're consumed in North America or in Europe, to think about those flows of carbon in terms of ecological questions is really important. So yeah, that's why I think when we're looking at these interdependencies, to try to look at them at the regional scale, but then internally within the regions, how flows of capital and labor fit into that, which relates to the second question around infrastructures and spaces of oil. And yeah, this is really, I think, I mean, I think it's quite fascinating to look at both infrastructures like ports, pipelines, the transport, tanker routes, you know, all of these infrastructures through which oil and other commodities flow become produced by this oil-based capitalism. So, you know, it's quite, it's you can see, I mean, to give an example that's not connected to East Asia, during the 1930s and 1940s, as the US oil industry was developing, a major international base before the Middle East, before the Second World War, was Latin America, and in particular Venezuela. And what the US oil industry did was to set up refining plants in Curacao and other Dutch Indies controlled islands nearby Venezuela. And these became the largest refineries in the world for a period of time. And what they would do would be to take Venezuelan oil, crude oil, take it to these islands where they would get processed in these US-controlled refineries, and then ship that oil back into the United States, where it was ultimately consumed, or those products, refined products, into the US where it was ultimately consumed. So it's very interesting. The reason for this was actually a labor question. From the perspective of both Venezuelan rulers at the time, as well as the oil companies themselves, it was much easier to discipline. They didn't want to face Venezuelan workers and the problems of Venezuelan labor. It was much easier to do the actual refining, the key process of oil, on these islands, nearby islands, where you had a compliant colonial regime, as well as migrant workers who were brought in to work these refineries. So the whole kind of infrastructure of oil was connected to the way that labor itself was spatially distributed through these different points of the oil circuit. And you can see that, I think, today in other respects. The Gulf, for example, is I've mentioned the migrant worker issue in the Gulf, but ports, the port system, the very large ports in places like Dubai and elsewhere in the Gulf countries that are connected to the oil trade and other kinds of commodity trade. So again, I think it would be really interesting to look at some of these large petrochemical refining projects in East Asia and trace these connections. I'd be curious to know, for example, in the Malaysian context, the Petronas one that I mentioned, the Saudi Aramco Petronas joint venture. I would be very interested to know more about the kinds of spatial organization of these large refineries, the labor composition in these large refineries, and so forth. Yeah, and finally, the social movements issue. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think, again, it's a wider regional question, because I don't think we should necessarily hope for or be looking necessarily for connections between social movements in the Gulf and East Asia, but think about more the Middle East at a regional level. And of course, since, well, for very many decades, but most recently since 2011, there was a huge uprising, a regional-wide uprising that occurred in the Middle East region, places like Egypt, Tunisia, and elsewhere. And those social movements, those protest movements, kind of reverberated globally. And I think they are very much present in different forms today. Like, political struggle in the wider Middle East region is very acute in several countries in the Middle East today. And I think there is potential to look at like cross-regional solidarity in places like Egypt, Tunisia, Lebanon, Iraq, and elsewhere, that are very much bound up actually with the oil economies and the place of monarchies, the oil-rich monarchs in the Gulf, their place in the Middle East. As I said before, like, these social movements in other Arab countries inevitably come up against the place of the Gulf in the hierarchies of the Middle East. So, it's connected to the Gulf, even if the protest movements aren't in the Gulf themselves, even though there were protest movements in the Gulf. So that's kind of, I think, where there's potential for cross-regional alliances. And historically, that's been the case. I mean, look at the question of Palestine. There has been historically strong movements in Asia in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, and that, I think, it has the potential to continue in the future.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was very good talk, I think. Well, I'm pretty sure we have a lot more things to ask and exchange, but it's time to let Adam go, I think. Thank you, Adam. I'm not sure whether you're fully recovered, but you spent 2 hours with us today to talk about a very much interesting issue related to oil that we don't really think about that much. So it was very enlightening. And Adam, it will be great if we can invite you in the future somewhere again. And thanks for all the participants today. It was a great discussion we had. And I'm going to be back with another talk next week by Liam Campbelling, which was also postponed, but it's happening next week. And he's going to talk about something else, but I think it will be also interesting talk. Thanks again to Adam, and let us close today's talk. Thank you very much, Adam.
Thank you. Thank you very much.